Okay, ready to dive into ancient India.
Sounds good.
You sent over some fascinating YouTube videos about this Harappan civilization and then the Vedic age.
Right.
So much to unpack.
Yeah.
It's amazing to me, you think about a civilization 5,000 years ago. I mean, that's even older than the Roman Empire.
Yeah, that's right.
With indoor toilets and, complex sanitation systems. We're talking about the Harappan civilization.
Right.
And it's amazing because their story was only rediscovered fairly recently in 1924.
Yeah.
It's like this whole chapter of human history was just, missing.
Yeah, it really is remarkable. Like a whole civilization just sort of disappeared
Right.
and then boom, it's rediscovered. And what's even more remarkable is that we're not just talking about like a small settlement or anything. This civilization, the Harappan civilization, it spanned a huge area
Wow.
across parts of what's now India and Pakistan.
Wow.
It was huge. To really get a sense of their achievements, I think it's helpful to focus in on one of their major cities, a city called Dhalavira.
Dhalavira.
Have you had a chance to look into that at all?
Yeah, Dhalavira. It's incredible. This bustling port city, located on an island in the Great Rand of Kutch. I mean, talk about a harsh environment.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible.
To not just survive, but really flourish in that kind of environment.
Yep.
Really amazing. And what stood out to me the most in that video you sent over were these massive reservoirs.
Yeah,
They said 9 times larger than Olympic swimming pools.
that's right.
I mean, that kind of engineering 5,000 years ago, just mind-blowing.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. It speaks volumes about their ingenuity, their social organization, their ability to plan for the long term.
Right.
They were living in a region with very little rainfall.
Right.
So capturing and managing water was absolutely essential to their survival.
It was everything.
And those reservoirs, they weren't just like impressive feats of engineering, they were lifelines for the entire community. So that level of planning, that level of resource management, it really sets them apart.
Yeah, you look at that and it makes you wonder, because it's not just survival. They even had a stadium, possibly the world's first. They might have held ceremonies, markets, maybe even chariot races there.
Right.
And then, of course, you can't forget those indoor toilets.
Oh, yeah.
These weren't just people focused on, just getting by. They were creating a really sophisticated and pretty comfortable urban lifestyle.
Yeah. I mean, it really challenges, some of our assumptions about what ancient civilizations were like, right?
Right.
I mean, think about it. When we picture ancient cities, what often comes to mind? Grand palaces, elaborate tombs for kings and rulers, evidence of a powerful warrior class.
Right, exactly.
But here's the thing. In Harappan cities, we see none of that.
That's true.
There's no real evidence of palaces, no grand tombs for kings, and no obvious signs of a dominant warrior class.
So are we looking at a surprisingly, egalitarian society?
Yeah.
I mean, a civilization where everyone, regardless of their social standing, had access to, those basic amenities like water and sanitation. That's a pretty radical concept, for the ancient world.
It is. And it certainly challenges our assumptions about how ancient societies function.
Right.
And yeah, some scholars do believe, they look at this evidence and they think that the Harappans, they might have actually prioritized the well-being of the entire community, not just, a select few at the top.
That's actually really supported by their city planning.
Yeah.
That grid-like street system
Yeah.
suggests a very organized, equitable approach to urban development. But then you have to ask the question, if they were so successful, what happened? What led to their decline?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, right? And it's something that scholars are still debating.
Right.
But right now, the leading theory is climate change.
Oh, really?
It seems like a prolonged drought, possibly a really, really severe drought, crippled their agricultural systems. And that would made it impossible to sustain their cities.
Right.
It's a stark reminder that even the most, advanced civilizations, they're still vulnerable to the forces of nature.
It's almost tragic, isn't it? You think of all that ingenuity and resourcefulness, and they still couldn't overcome that challenge. But what's interesting is their legacy does live on.
Oh, absolutely.
In some pretty surprising ways.
Yeah, you see it even today in India.
Right.
You see elements of their culture, like the reverence for the peepal tree, for example, or the use of the lota.
A traditional water vessel.
Exactly, for bathing and other rituals. And it's just amazing how these ancient practices, they've endured.
Thousands of years.
Thousands of years, that's right.
It really makes you wonder what other echoes of their civilization are still out there. But around 1900 BCE, as the Harappan civilization was fading, a new group appeared on the scene. the Indo-Aryans,
Right.
nomadic herders from Central Asia.
Yeah, this is a major turning point in Indian history.
It is.
The Indo-Aryans, they brought with them horses, chariots, a whole different social structure, a patriarchal social structure, and a new language, Vedic Sanskrit, which of course would go on to become the ancestor of many modern Indian languages.
Right. This ushered in the Vedic age, a period named after, their sacred texts, the Vedas.
Yeah.
And those texts, those give us some really valuable insights into their beliefs, their rituals, their social structure, and it reveals a very different worldview from what we see with the Harappans.
It does. And one of the most striking contrasts, I think, is their social hierarchy.
Okay.
The Indo-Aryans, they had a very rigid three-tiered system. You had the priests at the top, the warriors, and then the commoners. Each group had very specific roles and duties, and there was very limited social mobility. So very different from what we see in Harappan cities.
Much stricter.
Much stricter, yeah.
It really makes you wonder, could we even go so far as to call the impact of the Indo-Aryans on the indigenous population a form of colonization? Because, the videos mention this aggressive expansion and a reshaping of existing power structures. I mean, it definitely gives you that impression.
Well, I think it's important to be cautious about applying modern terms like colonization too loosely to ancient history.
Right.
But I think it's undeniable that the arrival of the Indo-Aryans had a profound and lasting impact on the Indian subcontinent. Genetically, linguistically, culturally, their influence is everywhere you look.
And the videos actually mention that genetic studies have confirmed that Indo-Aryan men were, let's say, interacting with local women at a very, very high rate.
That's right.
Which does suggest a significant power imbalance, possibly displacement of indigenous males. That's a complex and potentially turbulent interaction, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the picture that emerges is definitely one of cultural mixing. But it likely involved conflict and displacement as well, not just peaceful integration. It's important to acknowledge that this wasn't necessarily always a harmonious process. And it's through this kind of complex interplay of cultures and power dynamics that the Vedic age really begins to unfold.
And at the heart of this age, we have the Vedas.
Yes.
These fascinating texts that offer a glimpse into a world so different from our own. One of the things that really stood out to me was their religious beliefs.
Right, right. So the Indo-Aryans, they worshipped powerful male gods, gods like Indra and Agni.
Right.
They performed these elaborate fire rituals with these really hypnotic chants.
Okay.
And they would offer sacrifices, sometimes even including cattle.
Wait a minute, cattle. But isn't the cow considered sacred in Hinduism?
Yeah, so that reverence for the cow, that developed a bit later. While the Indo-Aryans, they did hold the milk-giving cow, they held it in high regard.
Okay.
They also ate beef, particularly male cows and older cows that were no longer useful for milk, so it's a bit more complicated.
It's a more complex relationship with the cow than we might associate with Hinduism today.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a good reminder that religious practices and beliefs, they're not static.
Right.
They evolve.
They evolve, yeah, over time. It's crucial to remember that we're looking at a period of significant change, both culturally and religiously,
Right.
where things were constantly in flux.
And speaking of change,
Yeah.
I think one of the most intriguing aspects of the Indo-Aryan arrival is that linguistic shift.
Oh, absolutely. So Vedic Sanskrit, the language they brought with them, it became the foundation for so many modern Indian languages.
Right.
But it's also fascinating to see how it absorbed sounds and words from the local languages spoken by, the women who were marrying these Indo-Aryan men.
Interesting.
And this linguistic blending, it's really evident if you look at the incorporation of retroflex sounds, for example, which are unique to the languages of the Indian subcontinent.
Right.
You don't find them in other Indo-European languages, so it's like this linguistic fingerprint. It really reveals this mixing of cultures that was happening during this period.
So we have these, subtle clues from language can help us kind of piece together this really complex picture of the past.
Language is such a powerful tool, for understanding history and cultural interactions.
Yes.
It tells us a story that goes beyond, just the written records or the archaeological artifacts. It's a whole other layer of information.
It's amazing. Now, we can't really talk about the Indo-Aryans without addressing this whole debate
Oh, yeah.
surrounding their origins.
Right.
And the videos mentioned there's pushback from some Hindu nationalists who see this whole idea of the Aryans coming from outside of India as, a threat to their narrative.
Right.
This idea that Hinduism is indigenous to India.
Right.
So they're clinging to this out of India theory, which claims that Sanskrit originated in India and spread outwards. It was kind of the mother of all these Indo-European languages. But from what I understand, that theory has been pretty thoroughly debunked.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, the out of India theory, it has its proponents,
Right.
but it really hasn't stood up to scrutiny
Okay.
from scholars across multiple disciplines. Whether you're talking about linguistics, archaeology, genetics, they all point to the Indo-Aryans migrating into India from the Eurasian steppes,
Got it.
not originating there.
So the evidence really is overwhelming.
It is.
And, it's interesting. The videos clarify that this term Aryan invasion theory, which is often used by those who reject the migration theory, they say it's actually outdated and misleading.
Yeah, I mean, the word invasion really suggests this single, large-scale military event.
Right.
And the reality was much more nuanced than that. The Indo-Aryan migration, it probably happened in waves, over centuries.
Right.
And it involved this complex mix of cultural exchange, sometimes conflict, sometimes assimilation.
So a much more gradual process than just a sudden takeover.
Yeah, much more complex. And I think understanding that nuance is essential for a more accurate picture of what happened.
Right. It's a good reminder that history is rarely black and white.
Yeah.
And as we kind of delve deeper into the Vedic age, we'll see how this complex story unfolds.
Sure. Right.
And how it really shapes the cultural, the linguistic, and the religious landscape of India for centuries to come.
For centuries, that's right. It really is the foundation. It's incredible when you think about it, This whole cultural and social transformation, it happened without a widely used written script.
Really?
Yeah, think about it. The earliest real concrete evidence we have of writing in India, it comes from those Ashoka's edicts.
Right.
And those date back to the 3rd century BCE.
Wow.
So that means the Vedic age, with all of its complex ideas, its philosophies, its epic tales,
Yeah.
it was all oral tradition.
It's mind-boggling to imagine, the sheer memorization skills
Oh, yeah.
involved in preserving all of that knowledge
I-
and transmitting it for generations. I mean, it really makes you appreciate the power of oral tradition
It does.
and the role it played in these cultures.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it really does challenge our modern assumptions, doesn't it?
Yeah.
About the importance of writing.
We take it for granted.
Yeah.
But eventually, of course, a written script did emerge in India.
It did.
And it played a really, really important role in spreading Buddhism.
Yeah.
But we're talking about the Brahmi script, right?
Yeah, the Brahmi script. That's considered to be the ancestor of so many South Asian scripts that are used today.
Right.
And while it first definitively appears in those edicts we were talking about,
Right.
Ashoka's edicts, some scholars believe that it might have existed for centuries before that.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's possible. Possibly written on, perishable materials. Things like palm leaves, which of course wouldn't have survived.
Right.
So it's like this hidden chapter, in the history of writing, just waiting to be unearthed.
It really is. And then you have Ashoka using that script to spread his message.
Right.
It's a fascinating story.
It is. So Ashoka, he was the Mauryan emperor who famously converted to Buddhism, right?
Right.
And he used Brahmi to inscribe his edicts. These messages on pillars and rocks all across his vast empire.
And these edicts were promoting Buddhist teachings.
Right. That's right. Emphasizing principles of dharma, ethical conduct, social welfare.
It's like an early form of mass communication,
Is.
using the power of writing to really disseminate his message.
Ugh.
But before we get ahead of ourselves and jump into the Mauryan Empire,
Yeah.
let's circle back to the late Vedic age for a second.
Okay.
You mentioned the rise of new urban centers,
Right.
distinct from the Harappan cities.
Yeah, that's right. So by around 500 BCE, we start to see new cities popping up
Okay.
in these fertile river valleys across North India.
Yeah.
Cities like Kasala, Kashi, Rajgriha, Vaishali, and they were shaped by this fusion of Indo-Aryan, Harappan, and other indigenous cultures. So unlike that uniformity we see in the Harappan cities, these new urban centers, they were much more diverse,
Interesting.
vibrant melting pots, different cultures, different languages, different religious practices.
So we're seeing a resurgence of urban life after centuries of, primarily rural settlement.
That's right.
And these cities weren't just cultural hubs.
Right.
They were also centers of trade and innovation.
That's right. And we even see the development of money economies during this period.
Really?
Yeah, with coins becoming a common form of legal tender,
Right.
which really facilitated trade and, contributed to the economic prosperity of these cities.
And it's amazing some of these states even experimented with democratic ideas,
It did.
similar to those in ancient Greece.
Great.
I mean, it really challenges this whole idea that democracy was solely a Western invention, doesn't it?
It does. It does. And, both India and Greece during this period, they witnessed these early attempts at, governing through discussion and debate,
Okay.
voting by a wider section of the population. Now, these experiments, they weren't fully democratic by, our modern standards.
Right.
They were probably closer to what we might call all oligarchic republics, where a select group of citizens held the real power.
Still pretty remarkable considering that most of the ancient world, was ruled by monarchies.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
But if these early democratic experiments were so promising, why didn't they last? What happened?
Well, there are a lot of theories out there. Some historians believe that maybe they lacked a strong unifying factor, like a shared sense of national identity.
Okay.
And so maybe the centrifugal forces of, regionalism and local identities
Right.
outweighed that pull of a shared democratic ideal.
So the diversity that made these cities so vibrant,
Yeah.
it could have also been a source of political fragmentation?
It's possible. It's possible. And of course, the rise of powerful kingdoms like Magadha, which would eventually go on to form the Mauryan Empire,
Right.
they probably played a role too. As these kingdoms expanded, they probably absorbed or overwhelmed these smaller, more democratic states. So it's kind of like history took a different turn.
It's fascinating. But even though these early forms of democracy didn't last, they still represent a really important chapter in India's political evolution.
They do, and they really do challenge our assumptions, about the origins of democracy.
Oh, right.
And they highlight these diverse ways in which, human societies throughout history have grappled with questions of governance and participation. And who knows, maybe the seeds of those early experiments, they actually influenced later developments in Indian political thought.
That's a fascinating thought.
Mm.
Now, alongside these political and economic shifts, the late Vedic age also saw this remarkable flourishing of religious and philosophical ideas. I mean, it's considered to be one of the most, prolific and creative periods in Indian history.
Yeah.
So what made this era so intellectually vibrant?
Well, it's often referred to as the Axial Age.
The Axial Age.
Yeah, it was a time when similar intellectual and spiritual fermentations, they were happening all over the world, from Greece to China to India. And in India, it manifested in new religious movements, new philosophical schools, critiques of the existing social order, like a global shift in consciousness. This period of, questioning and searching for new answers to some pretty fundamental questions about life, the universe, everything.
And in India, one of the most significant developments during this time was the rise of the Upanishads,
The Upanishads. Yeah.
which marked a real departure from that earlier, more ritualistic focus of the Vedas.
Right. So for those who maybe aren't as familiar with Hindu scriptures,
Right.
the Upanishads, they're considered part of the Vedas. They actually form the concluding sections of these ancient texts. And while those earlier portions of the Vedas, they focus primarily on hymns and rituals and sacrifices, the Upanishads, they delve into much deeper philosophical questions about the nature of reality, the self, and the relationship between the individual and the cosmos. So it's kind of like a shift from outward rituals to this more inward contemplation.
Interesting. And what kind of concepts are we talking about here?
Well, the Upanishads introduce some really profound concepts. Concepts like Brahman, for instance, which is, this ultimate reality that underlies all existence.
Okay.
And Atman, which is the individual soul or self. And what's really revolutionary is this idea that Atman is ultimately identical to Brahman,
Okay.
meaning that every individual, deep down, is a part of this universal divine essence.
That's a really powerful concept.
Yeah.
This idea that we're not separate, we're all connected.
Exactly.
No wonder the Upanishads had such a profound impact on Hinduism.
Yeah, they really laid the groundwork for so many of the key concepts and practices that would shape Hinduism.
Right.
Everything from yoga and meditation
Right.
to the pursuit of moksha, which is liberation from the cycle of rebirth.
Right.
But the late Vedic age, it wasn't just about this internal exploration. It was
Wow.
also a time when the existing social order, it was being challenged.
Right. Figures like Mahavira, the founder of Jainism, and of course, Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, they both emerged during this period,
Yeah.
offering these alternative paths to spiritual fulfillment.
Yeah, they were questioning things, and they weren't alone. There were others who questioned the authority of the Vedas
Right.
and the Brahmanical social order, and they represent this wave of dissent and intellectual ferment
Yeah.
that really challenged those established norms. So it was a time of intense questioning and exploration, you know?
Mhm.
Individuals were seeking new ways of understanding the world and their place in it.
It's really inspiring to see that even back then, people weren't afraid to challenge the status quo
Right.
and explore different perspectives. And it's this timeless human pursuit, searching for truth and meaning. And all this intellectual ferment, it really had a profound impact on the religious and social landscape of India.
Absolutely.
It led to the emergence of new religions, and you see this diversification of beliefs and practices that continues to this day. But amidst all of this change, all of this innovation, I keep coming back to the question of why those early experiments with democracy ultimately failed.
It's a tough one.
What factors really led to their decline?
It's a really complex question.
Yeah.
And there's no easy answer. You know, historians have offered a bunch of different explanations. Some point to, like we were talking about, a lack of a strong unifying factor, like a shared national identity, while others highlight the rise of these powerful kingdoms that might have just absorbed these smaller, more democratic states.
So maybe a combination of internal and external pressures kind of led to their demise.
Possibly, yeah.
Could the rigid caste system, which was already kind of prevalent during that time, could that have played a role as well in hindering the development of a broader, more inclusive political system?
That's a really interesting point. And yeah, it's definitely possible. You know, in a society where social hierarchy is so deeply ingrained, it might not have been very conducive to the ideals of equality and political participation,
Right.
Things that underpin a democracy. It's a good reminder that these political systems, they don't just exist in a vacuum.
Right.
They're shaped by all these social, economic, and cultural forces. So while these early experiments in democracy might have been short-lived, they still provide some really valuable insights, I think, into those challenges, those complexities of establishing and maintaining democratic systems.
Right. They remind us that the story of democracy is not a linear progression.
It's not.
It's a much more complex tapestry,
Yeah.
full of successes and failures and adaptations,
Right.
constantly evolving in response to, the circumstances. And as we move forward in our exploration of ancient India, we're going to see how this story continues to unfold. New empires will rise, religions will spread, ideas will clash, and it's all going to continue to shape the destiny of India and really the world.
You know, it's really amazing how those early attempts at democracy in India, even though they didn't ultimately work out, they still give us a lot to think about in terms of how complex governing can be.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
But before we get to the Mauryan Empire, there's one more thing we should touch on. Alexander the Great.
Oh,
His invasion of India. 326 BCE. I mean, everyone knows about Alexander's conquests. They're legendary. But I never really considered how they impacted India.
Yeah, it's actually a really interesting and often overlooked part of Indian history. Because while Alexander's campaign in India, it was brief,
Okay.
it really did have some significant consequences. I mean, for one thing, it exposed India to all sorts of new things,
Yeah.
Hellenistic culture, art, ideas, and you can actually see that influence later.
Yeah. In Indian sculptures and architecture, it's kind of like, in the midst of all that chaos and warfare,
Right.
this cultural exchange is happening.
Right.
And it leaves behind this unexpected legacy. So yeah, Alexander's invasion, it was disruptive, but it also brought new things to India.
So it was a conduit for new ideas and artistic influences.
Mhm.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Did it have any kind of lasting political impact?
Oh, absolutely. See, Alexander's campaign, it weakened a lot of the existing kingdoms in northwest India,
Okay.
and that created a power vacuum. And then you have this ambitious ruler, Chandragupta Maurya. He sees an opportunity.
So Alexander's invasion kind of paved the way
In a way.
for this unified empire
Great. Yeah.
in India. It's almost like those destructive events
Yeah.
can have these unintended consequences
They do.
that shape history
Yeah.
in ways you just don't anticipate.
Absolutely. It's like one of those weird historical paradoxes. It makes you realize how unpredictable things can be. And Chandragupta Maurya, he definitely sees the moment. He establishes the Mauryan Empire, which ended up stretching from Afghanistan in the west
Wow.
all the way to Bangladesh in the east. So this was huge. This is the first time that a really significant portion of the Indian subcontinent
Wow.
was unified under a single ruler.
That is just incredible. I mean, a vast empire like that must have been incredibly challenging to govern. What do we know about what life was like in the Mauryan Empire?
Well, one of our most valuable sources of information actually comes from a Greek ambassador. a guy named Megasthenes.
Ghastly.
He was at Chandragupta's court, and his writings, they give us these incredible insights into the administration, the society, the culture, during the Mauryan period. And he describes a highly organized bureaucracy, a very powerful military, a diverse population engaged in all sorts of different occupations. It sounds like a really well-structured, prosperous empire.
Sure does sound like a golden age that last. Throughout the whole Mauryan dynasty.
Well, things get even more interesting with Chandragupta's grandson, Ashoka. We've talked about him before.
The edicts.
Yeah, those edicts, right. Inscribed in the Brahmi script, promoting Buddhist teachings and ethical conduct. But his story is even more remarkable than that. See, after witnessing firsthand the horrors of war, Ashoka underwent this profound personal transformation. He converts to Buddhism and renounces violence altogether.
So he goes from conquering emperor to pacifist Buddhist.
Exactly, yeah. It's pretty amazing. It really shows you the power of ideas.
It does.
To transform not just individuals, but also entire societies. Because Ashoka's embrace of Buddhism, it really changed his reign.
Right.
He promotes peace, tolerance, understanding. He sends these Buddhist missionaries all across Asia, spreading the Buddhist teachings far beyond India.
Wow, that's incredible.
And his reign, it's often seen as, a true golden age in Indian history, a time of peace, prosperity, and the spread of these Buddhist values.
And those edicts, those inscriptions on pillars and rocks throughout his empire, it's like they're still speaking to us today.
They are. They really are. It's a reminder of his dedication.
To Dharma.
To Dharma, yeah. To ethical conduct, social welfare, religious tolerance. It's an incredible example, I think, of a ruler using his power to promote peace and compassion.
It really is. It makes you realize that one person can truly make a difference.
For sure.
As we wrap up our deep dive today, we've covered so much ground.
We have.
I mean, from the rise and fall of that Harappan civilization, the arrival of the Indo-Aryans, and then the development of the Vedic age, the emergence of the Mauryan Empire. It's a lot to take in. What stands out to you? I mean, what are the most important things we've learned on this journey through ancient India?
For me, it's the just incredible diversity and the dynamism of Indian civilization, even in those very early periods. I mean, you look at the Harappans with their incredibly sophisticated urban planning, the complex religious beliefs of the Vedic age, the flourishing of philosophical thought, during that axial age. It's clear that India has always been this place of incredible cultural and intellectual activity, and it's not a simple story.
No, it's definitely not a straight line.
Not at all.
It's a much more complex tapestry, woven from all these different cultures and beliefs and experiences. And even today, you can still see the legacy of those ancient civilizations. Whether it's those echoes of Harappan practices in modern Indian society, or that profound influence of the Vedas and Upanishads on Hinduism and Indian thought, it makes you realize that the past, it's not just something we study. It really does shape who we are today.
Yeah.
But the deeper we dive, the more we realize.
Right. How much we don't know. I mean, there's still so many mysteries. That undeciphered Harappan script. Where did those Vedic rituals come from? What was it really like when those Indo-Aryans encountered those indigenous populations? These are all questions that are still out there.
And maybe that's part of what makes history so interesting.
Oh, absolutely. It's a conversation that never ends.
It is. It's this ongoing exploration.
Yeah.
And it helps us understand the present and navigate the future. As we finish up today, I do have one final thought for everyone listening. Something to think about. Both the Harappan and the Vedic periods, they saw these significant shifts in how people interacted with the environment around them.
Right.
The Harappans with those amazing water management systems.
Right.
And the Indo-Aryans constantly adapting to new landscapes as they migrated. Given the climate challenges we're facing today, I think it's worth asking, what can we learn from these ancient civilizations about adaptation, resilience, finding that delicate balance between human societies and the natural world?
That's such a great question. And it really highlights how looking to the past can give us valuable insights.
Just to dealing with the present.
It does.
We're not the first ones to face these kinds of challenges. And their stories remind us that humans, we have this amazing capacity for innovation, for resilience, and for finding that harmony.
It gives you hope.
It does.
Oh, yeah.
It does. So, keep exploring, everyone. Keep asking those questions. Keep those deep dives going.
Well said.